Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'll be showing you how to build a PC in North, the latest mid-tower case from Fractal Design. And as you can see with the wooden front grille, they've gone with some really interesting design choices to make this case stand out from the competition. So taking a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today. For the motherboard I'm going to go with ASRock's Z790 Phantom Gaming Riptide. For the CPU, I'm going with Intel's new 13th Gen i7, the 13700K. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got the latest 360mm AIO from DeepCool, it's the LT720. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston's Fury Beast RGB DDR5 at 5600 megatransfers per second. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe M.2 drive for this build. It's from Sabrent and it's their Rocket 4 Plus in 2TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got an 860 watt fully modular power supply from Fractal Design. It's the Ion Plus 2 Platinum. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG Strix RTX 3080. And finally, for case fans, I'm going to be using Be Quiet's Light Wings. Okay, that's all the parts, let's get building. So I'm going to make a start by preparing the case. As we go, I'll point out the case's main features. So in terms of the side panel, the case is available in two different versions. I've got the one with the mesh side panel, which is going to give you additional fan mounting on the side and improved airflow, but it is also available in a tempered glass version, should you prefer a better look at your build. So to remove the side panel, we've got two captive thumb screws at the back. Once these have been loosened, the panel can simply be slid backwards, tilted out and lifted away. The other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. There's two captive thumb screws at the back which we need to loosen. Once these have been loosened, the panel can be slid backwards, tilted out and lifted away. Taking a look at our case's front I/O, we've got a nice premium metallic power button. We've got a separate headphone and microphone jack. We've got two USB 3.0 Type A ports and a single Type C port. Another nice design feature, we've got this nice leather tab on the back of our top panel. To remove the top panel is just a simple matter of pulling it backwards, lifting up and away. Taking a look at the panel we've just removed, you'll notice there's no dust filter at the top, although as most people are going to have the top as an exhaust, this shouldn't be a problem. Moving on to North's standout feature, and it's this wooden grille at the front. I've got the white version of the case, so it comes with an oak grille. If you get the black version, it'll be made from walnut. Removing the front panel is really straightforward. It just needs to be pulled out from the front and then it can be lifted away. Taking a look at the back of our front panel, you'll notice we've got a nylon dust filter on it. There's little clips on the side which we need to loosen up, and once they've been loosened, the dust panel can simply be lifted away for cleaning. With our front panel removed, you can see the two Aspect 14 PWM fans pre-installed at the front. If you prefer, you can mount up to three 120mm fans or up to a 360 or 280mm radiator at the front. At the top of the case, we can fit either two 140 or two 120mm fans or up to a 240mm radiator. If you do go with a radiator at the top, be careful of your ram height. It's going to be limited to 35mm. At the rear of the case, it's up to a 120mm fan or radiator, but Fractal haven't stopped there, and there's actually fan mounting slots on the PCI expansion slot brackets for an 80mm fan. So your fan's simply going to slot down here, and then you're going to be able to screw the fan in from the back through the holes here. Fractal haven't stopped there in terms of innovative fan mounting solutions. If you get the version of the case that has the mesh side panel, you get this bracket which is going to allow you to mount two 120 or two 140mm fans on the side. If you take a look at this panel here, it has 6 little notches in it, and the idea is you can line this bracket up by slotting it in here to the notches, sliding the panel over here, and then we've got two thumb screws on this side to allow you to secure the panel to the case. So you can see what this is going to look like on the side with two 140mm fans. So while adding in the side bracket with up to two 140mm fans should improve your airflow and your temperatures, and that's something I'll test later on, it does come with some limitations. The first one, in this top position, if you're going to install it here, the biggest limitation is reducing your CPU cooler height. The standard CPU cooler height in this case that is supported is up to 170mm. Although if you do install this bracket in its top position, that is going to be reduced down to 145mm, although there's going to be no limitation to your GPU width. So moving the bracket down to its middle position, and you've got exactly the same CPU cooler height limitations. You're limited to 145mm in terms of the maximum height. In this position, you are also going to have some GPU limitations as well in terms of the width. So if you install your GPU in the first 3 slots, like most people will be doing, the maximum width for your GPU is reduced from 178 down to 148, and that width needs to include the connector cables plugging into the GPU. With the bracket in this position, if you want to install your GPU in the lower 4 slots, there's no additional restrictions on it, and you're limited to 178mm in terms of width. Moving the bracket all the way down to its bottom position, you now don't have any additional limitations on your CPU cooler. It stays at the case standard of 170mm in terms of height, but your GPU is going to be limited no matter which of the slots you put it into to 148mm in width. In terms of GPU support, we've got 7 horizontal expansion slots at the back of the case, and you're actually going to be able to fit a pretty large GPU in this case, up to a maximum length of 355mm, although be aware if you do want to install a radiator at the front like we're going to do, that is going to limit your GPU length. In terms of motherboard support, it's up to ATX, but you are also able to mount a micro ATX and mini ATX motherboard if you prefer. Because I'm planning on installing a radiator at the front, we are going to need to remove this access panel. It's held on with a thumb screw here. We need to loosen it. Once it's been loosened, the panel can be slid backwards, tilted out and lifted away. To install a radiator at the front, we're going to need to remove the 2 140mm fans that are pre-installed at the front. They're each held on with 4 screws. At the bottom of the case, we've got a tray-style dust filter over our power supply's intake, and it simply pulls out from the back for cleaning. It is possible to remove this panel at the top of the case. It's held on with 4 screws. There's 2 on the top and 2 screws at the front. And then with the 4 screws removed, the top panel can simply be lifted away. The only reason I think you might want to do this if you need to change your I/O module, but you shouldn't need to remove this for the build, so I'm going to put it back in place. Moving into our rear compartment, it's good to see we've got rubber grommets over the 2 main cutouts to the right hand side of the motherboard, and we've got 3 Velcro cable straps which should help with cable management, as well as plenty of cable tie down points. At the top of the case, we've got a PWM hub with 4 PWM connectors on it, and coming from the other end, we've got a single 4-pin PWM fan connector to plug into your motherboard, which is then going to allow you to control the speed of everything plugged into here. And it's really nice to see there's no SATA cable required to power this, so it's going to work just off your motherboard. There is an option to move this to the back of the case if you prefer. It's held on with 2 screws at the other end in the main body of the case. So then we're going to be able to set the fan hub in at the back of the case and then screw it in from the back. So that's what it looks like at the back of the case. I think it's going to work better in its original position. I'm going to put it back to there now. Moving on to drive mounting, we've got this dedicated 2.5-inch drive bracket here, which can accommodate up to 2 2.5-inch drives. In terms of mounting the drives, it's really straightforward. We loosen the captive thumb screw here, the bracket comes out, you're simply going to set your drive onto here, turn it over and screw it from the back before returning it to the case. Moving down to the bottom of the case, we've got 2 hard drive trays down the bottom, and in the one closest to the front, we've got our case accessory box. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. I'll show you what that contains later on. So in terms of removing the drive trays, they're each held on with a captive thumb screw. So we can loosen up the captive thumb screw, and then with that removed, we can simply lift the drive cage out. And then same thing with the other one. So in each of these drive trays, you're going to be able to fit a 2.5-inch drive, a 3.5-inch drive, or both. Your 2.5-inch drive is going to go here, mounted towards the bottom of the drive tray. If you don't install a 2.5-inch drive, your 3.5-inch drive simply slots all the way into the drive tray. If you do want to have a 2.5-inch drive, you're going to install the 3.5-inch drive above it, slightly protruding from the top of the drive tray. So you'll notice down the bottom of the case, we've got a range of different slots that you can mount your drive cages in. So with the drive cage installed all the way to the front, as we have it here, this is the only position you're going to be able to fit another drive cage further towards the back of the case. The only slight issue with the drive tray at the front, it isn't going to interfere with a 360mm radiator, but if you want to install a 280mm radiator at the front, it isn't compatible with having the drive cage in this position. You're going to have to move it back along to the next slot. So in this position, you are going to be able to install a 280mm radiator at the front, but the only issue is you don't have enough space here to install the other drive cage at the bottom. And again, you can install the drive cage in this position, or just have one drive cage installed all the way at the back. Obviously, depending where you put the drive cage, it is going to limit your power supply compatibility. So in the furthest back position, the maximum length for your power supply is 140 millimeters. Move it along to the next slot, gets you up to 180 millimeters for your power supply. Moving it along another slot and you're up to 215. And then installed in the position furthest to the front, it's up to 255 millimeters of space for your power supply. Again, you also have the option to remove the drive trays altogether. So if you did want to go with a 280 at the front and you weren't able to have your hard drive cage in the position all the way to the front, meaning you couldn't mount the other hard drive cage further in the back of the case, there is another option. There's additional mounting slots on the roof of this compartment. So all we need to do is slide our drive cage into them and then screw it into place from here. So the only slight issue with mounting the drive up here is it is going to limit your power supply length again. So with it installed here, your maximum length is 155 millimeters for your power supply. And if you want to improve your storage, you can pick up an additional one of these brackets and have two at the bottom and one at the top. Another nice feature of the case is we've got a removable bracket at the back for installing our power supply. So it's got two captive thumb screws to remove it. What we're going to do is attach this bracket directly to the back of our power supply, and then we're going to be able to slide the whole thing into the back and re-secure it with the two thumb screws. So this is what comes in the case accessory box. So we've got a range of screws, we've got a standoff, we've got some rubber mounts for mounting drives, and we've got some cable ties. We're ready to start working the motherboard, and we're going to install the CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD, and our RAM, all before we put the motherboard into the case. To install our CPU, we need to open the socket cover, so we can push this lever down and all the way to the top, and then we can open the cover up. Next, we can set our CPU into the socket, line it up in the notches at the top and at the bottom, and importantly, you're going to want to have the text the correct way up. Once we're happy our CPU is sitting correctly in the socket, we can pull this cover down. If we apply a little bit of pressure here, the black bit of plastic is going to pop off, and we'll put that in our motherboard box, and then we can close the lever down to secure our CPU. Next, we've got our M.2 SSD, so we're going to need to remove this top heatsink. So behind the heatsink, we've actually got two M.2 SSD slots. We've got a Gen 5 slot here and a Gen 4 slot here. And we're going to install our drive in the Gen 4 slot because it's a Gen 4 drive. Be aware, if you do install it in the Gen 5 slot, you're going to be halving the PCIe lanes for your graphics card from 16 to 8. So that's the reason we're going with this slot. If you want to occupy the Gen 5 slot, you just need to remove this standoff from here to here, and then you're going to be able to insert your drive into here. So we can insert our M.2 SSD in at a slight angle into the Gen 4 slot. Then we can flatten the drive down and secure it into place with the screw from the motherboard box. Before we return the heatsink, we need to remove the plastic protection from the back. Next, we need to install the backplate for our CPU cooler, so we're going to need to remove these pins to the outer slot of this Intel bracket. So it's just a matter of pulling them all to the outer setting, and then the bracket should line up with the holes on the back of the motherboard. Then we've got one of these spacers to go into each corner. Now it's important to use the spacers labelled 1700. We are now ready to install the RAM, so we need to open the clips on the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU. We can then line the RAM up with the slot. Once everything's lined up with some firm pressure to the top of the RAM, it's going to clip into place. And then same thing with our second stick. Next, we can set our motherboard into the case, lining it up with the standoffs at the back. So what you'll notice is this middle standoff is solid, so it protrudes through the middle hole of the motherboard, helping hold it in place. And then we'll secure the motherboard into place using 8 of these mounting screws. Okay, next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard. So we'll bring it through the cutout, and you'll notice there's a pin missing on the header and a hole missing on the cable. So we're going to need to plug it in with the HD audio text facing up the way. Next, we've got our front panel connectors. They're going to go into this header at the bottom right hand side of the motherboard. If we bring them through this cutout, there is quite a bit of tension and they don't actually reach the header. There's a cutout here for the top mounted hard drive, so I'm actually just going to bring them through this cutout here because I'm not going to be occupying it. So starting off with the top row, working from left to right, pins 1 and 2 are for power LED positive and power LED negative. And then the 2 pins next to that are for our power switch. Our USB 3.0 cable is going to go into here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place. Just above this cable we've got a fan header, so I'm going to bring the PWM cable coming from our fan hub and plug it into this header. And then our Type-C header is just above that. We're now ready to install our power supply, and I've plugged in the cables we're going to need. So I plugged in a 24-pin cable, we've got two 8-pin EPS cables and two PCIe cables. Each of the PCIe cables has two 6+2 pin connectors. We're going to need a total of 3 of those, so we're going to have enough with 2 cables plugged in. Then we're going to use 4 of these larger screws to secure the case's power supply bracket to the power supply. Just before we put our power supply into the back of the case, this is our power supply's intake fan, so we're going to want to install it with it facing down the way. And then we can secure the power supply at the back with the 2 thumb screws. Next we're going to want to get our power supply cables plugged in, and we've got 2 8-pin EPS headers at the top left of the motherboard. So we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header and push into place. And then we can pull the excess cable through to the back. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with a header and push into place. Next we're ready to install our AIO, so we can set the radiator into the case. So I've had a slight problem at this stage. My plan had been to put the fans on this side of the radiator, screw them in with the long radiator screws, but the issue I'm having is this is my radiator installed all the way up towards the top of the case, but the bottom holes aren't actually lining up with the case. So there's no way for me to put the bottom screws in, and I'm not happy about having a fan on the radiator that's only secured with 2 screws. So the only option this leaves me is to put the fans on the other side of the radiator. The issue with having them there is it's going to limit my GPU clearance, and I'm not going to be able to install the GPU that I originally had intended to install. So I'm going to have to swap it out for something slightly shorter. So we can set our fans onto the radiator, and we're going to want to have our radiator as intake at the front. So that's the reason I'm installing the fans this way round. We can then use the long radiator screws to secure the fans to the radiator. Coming with each of our fans, we've got a 4-pin PWM connector, and DeepCool include this triple splitter cable with the AIO. So all we need to do is plug one of the fans into each of the connectors on this cable. And that's then going to leave us one 4-pin PWM connector to plug into our CPU fan header. So coming from our pump, we've got 2 connectors. We've got a 3-pin connector which is going to power the pump and also allow us to control the speed from the motherboard. The other is a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector to control the lighting. It's also got a splitter cable, so if you have limited ARGB headers on your motherboard, you are going to be able to plug something else in to here. We can then set the AIO into the case, and then we'll get it secured into place with the shorter radiator screws. So I still have the same issue that I'm not able to get the screws in the bottom holes, but that's not a big issue. I've got 10 screws holding the radiator in place. I'm then just going to route all our fan cables down to the bottom of the case, pushing them in down the side of the radiator so they're out of sight. I can then bring the cable through the cutout at the top and route it down to our CPU fan header, where I'm going to get it plugged in. And then we'll just tuck the excess cable up to the back. The next thing for us to do is fit the brackets to our pump. The reason I've waited to do it till now is because you'll notice we've got pre-applied thermal paste to the back of our CPU cooler, and we've got this protective plate over it. The problem is once we remove the protective plate to fit the brackets, we're not going to be able to fit it back on again. So I'm going to remove the protective plate now, and then I can set one of the LJ 1700 mounting brackets into place. And then we've got these little screws that come with the AIO. I'm going to pass it through the bracket and into the pump and screw it into place. And then we can set the bottom bracket into place and get it screwed in. And one of the nice things I'm noticing just as I'm screwing these in, it does seem to be magnetized. So if I drop the screw, it seems to go straight into the hole and stay there, which is just a really, really nice touch that DeepCool have got here. This can be quite tricky, but look at it, it just sits in the hole perfectly. The other thing that might help with the installation is this cover is removable. So it actually is just magnetically attached, so I can go ahead and pull it off. So then we can go ahead and line the AIO up with the bracket we installed earlier on. And what we're going to want to do is get a thumb screw onto each corner. The 3-pin cable we've got coming from the AIO, I'm just going to plug it into our pump header just above the CPU fan header, and then we'll just bring the excess cable up to the top. Just before we return the cover, there is some plastic protection over the mirror, so it makes sense to remove that outside the case. And then I can return the cover. The only additional cable is this RGB cable, and we've got two headers at the top of the motherboard, so I'm going to get plugged into them. And then again, I'm just going to route the excess cable up the side of the AIO and get it pushed up towards the back. Next, I'm going to install our 120mm fan at the back. So the first thing I'm going to do is pass the cables through to the back. And then we can secure it in at the back with the fan screws that came with the fans. I'm then going to bring the RGB cable coming from the fan through the cutout and get it plugged into this header at the top of the motherboard. Next, we've got two 140mm fans for the top, so I'm just going to pass the cables through to the back. And then we can get the fans screwed in at the top. And then at this stage, we can replace the top panel. Next thing to do is get our fans connected up, and I'm going to start with the RGB. So this is the fan that I plugged into the RGB header on the motherboard. It's got a splitter cable on it, so I'm going to pull the cover off. And then I'm going to connect our second top fan into that. And then take the RGB cable coming from our rear fan and daisy chain it into that. So that's all three fans connected up to the one header. Then we've got the PWM connectors, which are going to plug into our hub. So there's 1, 2, and 3. We're now ready to install the graphics card, so we need to remove the second and third PCI expansion slot cover. So as I mentioned, my original plan was to install the RTX 3080, but as you can see here, it's just too big with the fans installed on this side of the radiator. If the fans were on the other side of the radiator, it would have fitted just about, but it would have been a tight fit. So the only other graphics card that I have immediately available to me that's small enough to fit with the radiator in this particular configuration is the RTX 3050. So I'm definitely not recommending pairing a 3050 with a 13700K, but it's the best I can do for today. And you should be able to follow along to this build guide, just replacing this with a more reasonable graphics card that will fit. So we need to open the top slot on the motherboard, line the graphics card up with the clip, and once we're happy everything's lined up, apply some firm pressure and the graphics card is going to clip into place. And then we can secure the GPU with the same two thumb screws that we removed earlier on. So we can then bring our PCIe cable through the cutout at the bottom and get it plugged in to the graphics card. I'm then just going to use one of the included cable ties to manage the additional connector coming from the cable, and then we'll pull the excess cable through to the back of the case. Next, we can set the access panel back into place. So next we can install our two original Fractal fans that were at the front of the case into the fan bracket that we're going to put onto the side. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pass the cable through the cutout here. And then we can turn things over and get the fans screwed in from the back. So I'm just going to plug the cables coming from the fans into a header at the bottom of the motherboard. And then I'm just going to start pulling the fan cables through to the back. So the extra splitter cable is down, and then I'm going to bring both cables slightly down, so once I install the front fans I'm going to be able to pull the excess cable to the back of the case. And then I can bring our fan bracket up to the front of the case, and really the only place that makes sense to me to install is down at the bottom, where it's going to bring extra air to our GPU. And this would definitely be a better test with the RTX 3080 rather than this 3050. And then we've got some cable management to do. So that's the build complete. I've gone ahead and set the PC up. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, get all the RGB software set up, update the BIOS, adjust the BIOS settings, I'll put a link to another video I made with an ASRock motherboard, and the process for installing and setting everything up is going to be very similar to this. So putting this video together with that video, you should be able to get a fully working PC. What I'm planning on doing now is some thermal testing, and then I'm going to do a full case review. So you want to know what I thought about this case, you're going to want to check that review out, and again you'll find a link to that video in the description. So hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.